So the last step that we're going to go over today is to figure out what data you need. And this is a step where I think I get the most resistance because I'm making you guys think about what data you need before you start thinking about how to collect it. And now all of my research, I partner with all different kinds of size and of agencies and very grassroots and community-based organizations. And I think everyone's experience is you go to either what data already exists or the data collection method you're already familiar with. So when I ask people, what data do you think you need in order to do your assessment to achieve that goal, they'll say surveys. And I'll say, but surveys aren't a data. Surveys are a way of collecting that data. So this step, I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I'm going to make you think through, really, what data do you need to make sure that you understand prevalence, if prevalence is what you want to know, to make sure you understand access, if access is what you want to know, right? So oftentimes what I see is folks will say, want to understand, like, for example, teen dietary behaviors. And they'll say, there's this great survey they do in the schools, ask them about nutrition knowledge. And I'll be like, but is that going to answer your question about behaviors? So sometimes we jump to the data that's already available, we jump to the survey that has already been created, and it's actually not serving the need of what it is that we wanted to learn about, which in this case was behaviors instead of knowledge. Knowledge sometimes leads to behaviors, but as we know with diet, oftentimes it doesn't. So sometimes we all know what we're supposed to be eating. That doesn't mean that we do it, right? So the first thing that I want you to do, the first thing that you'll need to do is actually come up with your research questions. Now, some funders like to see goals and objectives. Some funders like to see research questions. So it's a good idea to try to come up with both. And a research question or a primary question is to further focus your assessment. It's to help you develop answerable questions, because you don't want to pose any questions that are impossible to answer. It's something that extends from your partnership, from the planning that you're doing together. I usually like to come up with around 3. Honestly, every grant I've ever written has had 3 research questions. I don't know why. I think I was probably trained to do it that way. You don't want to have too many. But just like you do with everything else, you'll probably want to just, within your planning group, brainstorm, prioritize. And here are some examples of some questions. Where do community residents go for health services? What local health services do residents use the most? Which do they use the least? Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that these are questions you're asking yourselves of the community. These are not the questions that will go into surveys, focus groups, interviews, photo voice, discussion guides, right? These are questions to guide you as the community partnership. Now they could end up being that you ask people, where do you go for health services? And it's very similar. But it could also be that there's a series of questions that are asked in order to answer this research question. Is that clear? You could have very specific questions. Are those services accessible to most people, either because of location of hours of operation, public transportation, language, and cultural competency, accessibility for those with disabilities, right? Health literacy, that kind of thing. Your question could be, which diseases or conditions affect the community the most? So oftentimes it's just a rephrasing of your goal. Maybe just a little bit more clarification of your goal, but there's no better way to figure out what data you need to collect to answer those questions than to actually ask it as a question. Some other examples could be that you want to compare your community to other communities. So oftentimes we have questions that are specifically about prevalence in our community, but also how does that compare to other communities either around this community or for the entire city of Philadelphia or Baltimore or state of Virginia or whatever. Sometimes our questions are comparison questions. And then you can see the kinds of questions that we might ask very specifically of that specific focused assessment that I mentioned about the high school teens. What do high school students know about eating a healthy diet? and what foods are available for high school students, both on campus and nearby, right? And so you could see how those are sort of aligned with some of the objectives that we had used as an example earlier. So once you've thought about your goal as a question or a series of questions, then the next thing you want to do is to think about what kinds of data will answer that question. So what is data? It's like another question like community. What is data? Roxanne. It's starting to come out.
I know. I'm trying to think of how can I say it without using the word data. Points of information.
Points of information.
That when grouped can give a picture of something greater.
Oh, I liked that. That was nice. She was brainstorming there. So it's information. It tends to be grouped. It's information that's collected in a little bit more systematic way than a fact, right? A fact is usually information, but like my son had to do a project this month for International Women's Month, and he chose J.K. Rowling because he just read the Harry Potter books. So his poster was like 100 facts. She was born in 1965, and Derbyshire or whatever in England, and and like she the first book she published was in this year. So those are facts. You don't need to collect that in a systematic way. It's usually one data point that is that kind of information. When we're talking about data, we're talking about information. They could lead to factual statements, but usually you're collecting it in more of a systematic way, right? So I like to use the example, I train teens a lot to participate in research, and I like to use the example of, what kinds of music do your friends like, right? And I ask them, and they know, they'll say the answers, right? They'll say they like hip hop, they like, jazz, whatever, they'll say it. And I'll say, how could you prove that those are the types of music that your friends like? And they can't, because they didn't collect it in a systematic way. It was experiential. Sometimes the information we want is experiential. It doesn't have to be proven with numbers or percentages or frequencies or anything like that. But sometimes, and quite often, what funders and policymakers like to see is the kind of information that was collected in a systematic way and does allow us to be able to prove that these are the musical preferences of this particular peer group. I know I just made that "what's your friends like" into a very boring statement, but that is the kind of factual statement you could make if you systematically surveyed all of your friends and asked them, and and had them either free choice or choose from categories. We're going to talk in the next step about the different forms that data can take from, you can answer whatever you want, or you're given different response categories and you have to choose, and the limitations of both. But that's what data is, and oftentimes it is for the purposes, so it can be grouped in different ways, and it can be looked at in relation to other data that you collect. So it could be that you want to look at experiences with adverse childhood experiences, and then also opioid misuse, and you want to look at those two data together, so you want to collect that data in as systematic of a way as possible in a format so that those comparisons can be made, right? And maybe you want to make comparisons with other counties in Pennsylvania or something like that. So that's what data is. Now, what types of data are there? Yeah, Sadie. Quantitative and qualitative. So we're going to talk in a minute about the differences between qualitative and quantitative. So those are definitely structures of data. What are like words that come to your mind when you think of data? What did you say, Kalina?
Oh, I said primary and secondary.
Primary and secondary. We're also going to talk about the differences between primary and secondary data.
Numbers, graphs.
Numbers that can produce graphs. Graphs themselves aren't the data are the numbers, and you can produce graphs from the data.
Self-report and independently identified.
Self-report or observed, directly observed, right? Subjective or objective, sometimes people say, and those are different types of data. What about like, oh yeah, sorry.
No, I was going to say like documents or triangulation.
Documents like transcriptions or like content analysis of media, right? So sometimes you can, colleague of mine here at School of Public Health looks at Twitter data to see what people are saying about various health issues, right? So like language, words used can be data as well. What else? You mentioned photo voice, Molly.
Visual media.
So visual media, photos, digital storytelling. What else? A lot of people talked about what assets exist, how certain neighborhoods compare to others in terms of what's available. What is that? What kind of picture do you get in your mind? Map, yes, maps and mappable data or other different types of data as well. And then I mentioned a few in the objectives, like sales data. I've done a lot of work in like cafeteria, like high schools and schools and stuff like that. Sales data, observational data, of what kids are eating, what they're throwing away. Survey data, certainly opinions, priorities, concerns, things that are asked directly of people through the various means that we're going to talk about. But their opinions, their concerns, their behaviors, knowledge, attitudes, those are all types of data. And then we'll talk about how we're going to collect it, right? So if you want to know what people know, or if you want to know what their social norms are, what their attitudes are about certain health topics, if you want to know what they actually do on a day-to-day basis around opioids, around food, around exercise, around HIV, sexual, risk-taking, those are all types of data, and then we can talk about how it would be collected. So everything can be data, right? But oftentimes people think about, first thing, usually people say demographics. Actually, I'm surprised you guys didn't say that. But characteristics about people, age, gender, race, ethnicity, and neighborhood of residence, annual income, educational attainment, that kind of stuff. Housing, housing situation or housing, owning or renting. Services, referrals, or resources provided. So there's some data we can get from providers. And then there's some data we can get by either patients or community members about actual use of them, or attitudes or perceptions or opinions about those. Oftentimes you had said numbers, right? Numbers which can be expressed as proportions or frequencies or rates, which is a way of standardizing information. We're going to talk about in step 5 about like the numbers of diseases per certain number of the underlying population, which is just a sort of a different multiplier than 100, which is what you do for percentage. But there's standardized rates that we often will compare rates of disease in our community versus like the citywide rate or the statewide rate or the national rate, right? Behaviors or practices, behaviors of like community members or patients. We're concerned about healthy behaviors, but also the practices of, medical providers or case management services are also behaviors. I already mentioned opinions, perceptions, priorities. The thing that people mention to me is like, well, how do you know that that's true? And I say, well, it's true if someone believes it, right? People think that's too messy to ask people about, but the truth is that sometimes that's exactly what you need to know from people, right? Aspirations, motivations, a lot of the work I do with youth is about, self-esteem and self-efficacy and a future, orientation and ability and feelings of ability to achieve that, right? Oftentimes we want to know, like in my work evaluating the Dornsife Center, it's like who's aware of the Dornsife Center for Neighborhood Partnerships, which is a neighborhood center that Drexel runs. And, do they know about what's offered there? And what's their attitude? Do they think this is just another way that Drexel's trying to encroach on their neighborhood boundaries? And those are actually questions in my survey. And what are their attitudes about it? Or do they go there? What are their behaviors around? Have they been there? Do they go there? Have they used any of the services? And you can ask people about concerns. We can ask people about assets and skills that we've been talking about. You can ask at the individual level, and you can ask about awareness or existence at the community level as well. I've already talked about sales transactions, social media content, and policies, so policy tracking. What policies exist, what their content is, whether they're enforced, that kind of thing can, policy tracking can be data as well. So just to visually show you, we had a Healthy Corner Store initiative in New Haven. So this was after our extreme corner store makeover, where we provided some refrigeration services and some healthy snack areas in the front of the store. And then this was some of the asset mapping I did, which I'll talk about a little bit later with some examples of my work, but tobacco and food outlets outside of the schools that were in our study. So you can see those, this is a data point, and all of that was mapped are various data points that could be expressed geographically in this case. So, not to overwhelm you with the different types of data, but just to, and there's a million more that I'm sure you guys can come up with, right? In fact, is there anything that wasn't in that laundry list? I should ask you.
Well, there's scope of data, right? So if you're down at the individual level.
Yeah, so there's different levels. Yeah, absolutely.
Some biological data.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't even really have clinical data in there either. You can see where my heart is. But yeah, clinical data, biometric data or biological data, glucose levels, hemoglobin A1C, height, weight, body mass index, all that kind of stuff. HIV viral load. Yeah, I didn't put any of that stuff in there. Sorry, I'll add that next year. But I want you to think creatively about what could answer the research questions you guys are going to set up for yourselves, right? Don't just go straight to what exists. Maybe think about if you're having to do a health assessment in the state of Virginia, and if you're going to have to collect some primary data, which we'll talk about in a second, data that hasn't been collected before, then you could think about some interesting new things to ask folks that haven't been asked. I mean, there's no better way to contribute new data to a topic than to collect new data that hasn't been collected before. But there's many different kind of data that can answer your questions. There's an infinite number of assessment study objectives that could be articulated and research questions that could be posed. And so there's an infinite number of types of data that could answer your question. And of course, it would be good to collect it all, but I think what I see most often is that everybody wants to collect everything because you have this opportunity and you do want to. And then what ends up happening when you ask everything, collect everything? Kalita, you're shaking your head.
No, I'm completion.
There's no better way to drive people away from your survey or focus group than to ask them too many questions. Participant exhaustion. So we have to be respectful of people's time and also what's feasible to collect within a time frame with the resources you have, with the staff you do or do not have, as some of you have already noticed. And to make sure that it is still fulfilling that goal and objective, that if prevalence was something that you said in your goal and is really important to this group, that you're actually collecting data that's going to answer that research question that you develop underneath that goal. And your prioritized research questions as well. So going back to these research questions that I posed, the first ones are sort of about that broadly focused goal about access to care. And the last two are about that more narrowly focused assessment goal about healthy eating in teens. What data could answer where do community residents go for health services? Think about types of data and not ways of collecting it. Where are they going? How would you get that? Yeah.
You can map it if there's a building with a doctor in it.
Yeah, so it could be that there's some bricks and mortar things that could be mapped in terms of services provided, right? So that's that sort of like provision of services type of data that I mentioned.
I was going to say, look at numbers of clients for different health services.
You can look at caseload, client load of those services as well, absolutely. Shani.
Insurance related, health insurance related info, is that explains where the billing for the parties going?
Yeah, if you have access to claims data, but whether or not people have access to insurance isn't going to get you to where they're going necessarily. But if you have access to insurance claims, then certainly you'll be able to figure that out. Yeah.
Don't you need to figure out exactly where SSI are actually offered within the community before looking at where they go for it?
Absolutely. So there's a bunch of different sides of this. It could be what exists.
Yeah.
So it could be mapping those, but it could be a whole process of even figuring out what's offered.
Yeah.
Asset inventories or service inventories are can be like a whole first phase of your assessment. And then understanding, what insurance they take and what accessibility and hours and things that they have, then you could also be asking who's their caseload and also asking in the community who's going there. Yeah.
Depending on the community and type of area, for example, like an urban versus like a suburban, and depending on if you have a low-income community with like, they're only taking public transportation, where are the bus routes going?
Right, so transportation can definitely be a part of that. And it could be that, you know, if you pose this question, that those specific details are going to answer that question, but we know that, you know, that's helping you to understand who's going, or how many people are going, or where they're going, right? So let's go down to this specific. So what do high school students know about eating a healthy diet? What types of data will we need to collect to answer that question?
That would be more of like interviewing students. I guess you can,
Well, interview is a method.
well, yeah,
So what would you need to know from them?
what they
What they know.
like give them a quiz and see how they
So a
do.
quiz could be like a knowledge quiz. Laura, you had an
Yeah,
idea?
that's what I was gonna say, how much they
Yeah.
know about, eating, and what they are eating presently.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
the
that's gonna
difference.
answer, not that question, that's gonna answer a question about their behaviors,
Okay,
which is fine, but you wanna pose another question about behaviors, right? This is where people get mixed up between knowledge and behaviors, but this is about, and maybe you pose this question because it's all intended to improve or create a nutrition education program.
Yeah.
Right? So this is a pretty narrowly focused research question, but if you just want to understand both knowledge and behaviors, you might either pose it a little bit more broadly or have two research questions. And I say this, I only slow you down in this moment because I've seen a lot of cases where people wanted to ask behaviors, but they had knowledge questions, so they just asked the knowledge or vice versa. Would somebody have their hand up? Yeah.
You're gonna wanna also question school officials about how many hours of health education, for example, are students getting?
Yeah, so there could be a provision side of this as well, and it could be what is it that they're teaching, and then maybe you could have access to their grades in that class, in those classes, but that may not get you to what the kids retain, and so I think getting, you know, doing some questioning of the kids will probably get you to some sense of what they're actually retaining of that material.
So that's where something like unique, like getting the students to go into, like a food store and either taking pictures or selecting the healthy foods.
Yeah, I thought you were gonna go to assessing what was healthy in the store, which would not answer the question about what they know. That would actually, if you made this what healthy foods are available, that would be a type of information that would help you answer this question. And I did that in New Haven, I had kids doing asset mapping of things in their community environments that were conducive or barriers to healthy eating and exercise and smoking. But you could use that as a way for them to help identify in the store what are the healthy options, and that would get you to their knowledge. You know, it's one thing we know in nutrition, there's like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, they could,
Yeah.
like, if you went into a store, they could divide them into categories of healthy and unhealthy, and then you could go even further and have them divided into different food groups.
Right, so you're going well down the road of what that method would look like, but what it is that you're trying to understand is their knowledge, and even more important, what I like about this example, practical knowledge at the point of decision making about purchasing things. And so there are some folks who will collect data in that moment as opposed to just generally you're sitting in a nutrition education class and the kids are getting an A in the class. How much is that telling you of how much they're translating that knowledge into, you know, they live in a food desert at home, you know, their parents both work, they're the ones making food choices for them and their younger siblings. That's a whole different story, right? So people have gotten very creative about ways to assess knowledge or to assess behaviors in the real world, and that could be one of those ways. So you guys mentioned this earlier, but the first thing that you have to, the second thing, after identifying the kind of data that would answer your question, is to figure out what are some potential sources for those data. So primary and secondary data have already been brought up. Oh, I was going to ask you guys to find them. Now I've already Sorry. But primary data, well, secondary data is data that's been collected for another purpose. Usually we look to those that are collected by like cities, state, federal agencies, because we know that they're reputable. We're going to talk about sort of credibility of data in a minute. But it could also be that somebody, a colleague, you know, at the School of Public Health collected it, Children's Health Watch survey, and they've decided that, you know, it would be okay for you to use those data and you're not going to share names or whatever. That's secondary data too. It could be that the community college has like a service learning program where kids are going out, where students are going out and collecting data about community health needs, and they think, hey, wouldn't it be great if these data were used outside of just this, you know, service learning class, and they can make that data available for you. So there's also like grassroots versions or like more local versions of secondary data. So I usually, first of all, my advice is start first with data that already exists. If you could answer all your research questions with data that already exists, then hallelujah, go with it. Use your resources to get the word out, produce some nice, you know, user-friendly reports or websites, or do a community town hall meeting to discuss what this means and strategize for next steps. Use your resources for that. However, as we'll talk about, not all secondary data, most secondary data is not exactly what you need, so you'll have to do that pro and con. But I do a web search, and I will literally look for social cohesion in West Philadelphia survey, click, see if anything comes up, you know, and just figure out if there's something that you didn't know about. Philadelphia Department of Public Health collects a lot of fantastic data that you might not have known about. But if you can't get all the data you need to answer your question from secondary data, then you'll want to collect primary data. And primary data just means that it's data that's being collected for the first time. If you share it with someone beyond you for your initial purposes, then your data will become secondary data. And that's the only way that we make that distinction.
Question, when you're thinking about like different regions and things like that, does it impact negatively in the eyes of, like, for example, if you were to go for publication or in funding, if your data, the same type of data from different regions is sourced differently?
What do you mean? If you're making
Like, for
comparisons
example,
and the data are
Philadelphia-
coming from two different places?
Yeah, like Philadelphia might already have data on, you know, how refugees, you know, access healthy foods.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe Lancaster doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And because they have different resources and they're different types, like one's rural, one's, urban, they're different.
Mm-hmm.
So would that negatively impact, you know, my results if they're,
Not
if
necessarily.
Philadelphia had it and Lancaster, I had to go search for that data?
Not necessarily. So I do this all the time. I think the creativity of my job is trying to figure out where I can get my hands on data. What is the best data that exists that is going to tell the story of immigrant or refugee, you know, population or health needs or whatever. And then I will try to figure out the best possible way to either integrate them. So I love to get a lot of data in a neighborhood and try to integrate it so I could look at housing and asthma rates and refugee status and, you know, and just see if I could tell a more complete picture by using creative data sources together. Or when we put together that opioid report for the state of Pennsylvania, some of it was coming from like just one data source and some of it is cobbled together. We're doing like a survey part of it now, and there's some of the county use YRBS, Youth Risk Behavior Survey, right? And then some of them use PAYS, which is the Pennsylvania Adolescent Youth Survey. And so we have to, and some of them are the same questions, and some of them are slightly different. They ask in the last 30 days, did you use opioids? Or they ask in the last 6 months. And you kind of have to do your best to show side by side. Well, to the best of the data that exists, we're able to demonstrate that there might be more of a need in this area, or maybe we don't have enough information, but this is the best we could do to describe the picture, and this is what we advocate for next steps in terms of data needed or resources needed, right? So there's a lot of caveats to using secondary data, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but that's exactly what you would do. You would say what the caveats were to that. Well, it wasn't perfect, but it's all that exists. And sometimes that's the best place to start, especially in a new area where there isn't some, like, you know, nationally recognized way to collect these data, and every state is doing it exactly the same way, and every, you know, municipal health department is doing it the same way, because that's often not the case, right? So you have to weigh those pros and cons. And so Some usual secondary data sources are city or county or state health departments or other offices, or regional, HUD or DHHS that are federal but have the purview of your region. Vital statistics, which can take a while to gain access to. The Urban Health Collaborative, we just finished like a 2-year process of getting access to those data, but they are technically available. School district data, the School District of Philadelphia does have an open data portal where they do show all of the data for their spring district-wide survey. They've done 2 rounds of it now. You can't download the data, but you could pull the data points from each one of their graphs if you so need, which I've done. Police district data, again, some of that in Open Data Philly is available online. If your city or state has open data portals, it's a good way to find all this data. There's also this big movement towards civic tech where people try to highlight for others who are trying to make change in their community what data are available publicly, with no identifiers, obviously. It's sort of like usually at the neighborhood or the region or the city level, but where you can gain access to those, yeah.
I was just wondering if you have suggestions, maybe you'll get into this, when it's something like open source data that's editable by like the community, how you kind of address that when you're doing a community assessment, where, the source is not something that's very consistent, that it could have been.
Yeah. Let's hold on for that when I talk about evaluating data sources, because that's a great point, yeah. So you see it all here. I mean, I think, the benefit of universities or community colleges is that they tend to be, have a lot of research infrastructure. They may not be mission aligned, or they may be, but that's a place to go. And here in Philadelphia, Public Health Management Corporation has their biennial health survey. So there's an infinite number of places, and I feel like this list and the ability to access the data from sources in this list is growing exponentially because of this movement toward open data portals, and folks, and Philly has been really good about this. There being nonprofits or other agencies that are, presenting the data in such a way so that it can be useful, that it's not just like, some open, some like data query system, like some of the federal surveys or census data. I didn't even put census data in there, but census data is all publicly available. But to download it, you kind of have to understand how to use that data. It can be very complicated, especially for community leaders. So there's this movement toward these data that are publicly available, digesting them in such a way so that they could be a little bit more usable. So let me just, yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for a big question we get is mental health data, which is not available. It's very hard.
Yeah.
I think it's protected. Do you have any suggestions on where to get that data, and also what's like the best?
Well,
level,
surveys, so it depends what you need.
Yeah.
If it's people's responses to survey questions about whether or not they've been diagnosed with a mental health condition, or whether or not, or their subjective, sort of health ratings, which sometimes have mental health specific questions, then you can go to survey data. If you're wondering how many diagnoses, because it's not like mandated to be reportable like some other diseases are, then you have to partner with either the systems that are providing those services, which could be private, they could be, for Medicaid mental health providers, they could be public. Like in the city of Philadelphia, our Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services is also the Medicaid mental health provider for the city. And so in my work evaluating their mental health first aid initiative, I actually produce an annual citywide behavioral health indicators report for them. And a lot of that data is coming from their own utilization data, their claims data. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I think survey data can get you to sort of the population level. So you can ask a population how they feel on a given day, what diagnoses they have, what health issues or concerns they have, or you can go straight to a patient population, which is a subset of the larger population, and find out what they're seeking and receiving. And those are two different pictures of the same issue. So it depends what your question is. Is it about prevalence? Then population-based surveys might be better. Or is it about like provision and utilization? Then patient data and provider data would be where you would want to go. And it's like a whole different pathway. So you guys can see this in your books, but you know, there's pros and cons. Secondary data is cheaper than collecting it on your own. Somebody else has gone through all the headache. It can help you figure out a baseline for which you might want to see, you know, if your assessment is to create a baseline and to see after interventions are implemented, do you see improvement? Then secondary data might be a good use for you in that context. And it can help make comparisons with other regions of the city, neighborhoods, or counties, or as we talked about. It's quicker because you don't have to collect it yourself. And it may answer your research question. You notice all the question marks, all the exclamation points there, because I'm like, if it can do it, then go for it. But it may not be exactly what you need. It may be outdated, but it may be the most recent data that exists. So you kind of have to do a little digging to figure it out. If it's not publicly available, like if you want to enter into a data use agreement with a clinical service provider or other data gatekeeper, it might be a long process to gain access to that. You might have to go through some hoops for a data use agreement, and you may need to pay for that data. And there's often restrictions to access. Certainly nobody's gonna give you patient data that contains any information about that patient, right? So there's levels of access to data, and you know, even if you're looking for data in the aggregate, sometimes there are data sources who will never give it to you regardless of how much you want it in the aggregate, meaning that it's combined and it's not at the individual level. It's just like, you know, for this neighborhood, how many hospitalizations around opioid overdoses was there? And the data quality varies and may not be obvious. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I want you guys to go into your groups, but I will give you these slides. And there are five criteria for evaluating data, and I just want to bring it up because we are in the age of fake news and alt facts, and it's really hard. You kind of have to be researchers just to be able to figure out what data sources are actually real, right? So, I don't want to presume anybody's political affiliations, but Donald Trump is not known for finding, you know, peer-reviewed sources for his tweets. But, you know, here's something that he tweeted that actually had, like, a fake source. So, you know, as I tell my students in the master's program here, like, you gotta look for that source, right? If you dig, there is no Crime Statistics Bureau in San Francisco, right? That's fake. And sometimes you gotta dig even harder to get to the bottom of something. So you need to figure out, is the source credible? Federal government, regardless of, you know, your political affiliations, is a credible source. You need to think about whether or not the data is specific to your needs. So an example I have in a later slide when you see the slides is, if you're looking for Korean American women's smoking prevalence data, but you get Chinese American women's smoking data, that's data that's specific to a different population, so it's not specific enough for your population, right? You want to make sure the data are reliable, which means that multiple researchers or surveys or federal government agencies or whoever's collecting the data have found the same thing, right? So user data, like you were saying, community user data, that could be really great. It's sort of like, you know, it's sort of like democratizing data, right? It's participatory, it allows people to chime in, but is it being collected rigorously, or is it only those who are online? Is it only those who are particularly excited about a topic or particularly pissed about a topic, right? So I call it the Yelp effect. You either get the people who love that restaurant or hated that restaurant. There's no like, this restaurant was fine. It's my course evaluations are the same. Like, I love the slides, I hated the slides, and then I don't know what to do with that, right? So reliability means that the same or similar results have resulted from doing this periodically using similar methods, and that's where the structure and the rigor of research comes into it. You could use that data and say this, but with the caveat of this reflects, an open data source where we don't know whether or not these data or the users were biased in any way. But we do know that this is what they said, for what it's worth, right? Generalizability means that the data that you collect, let's say in Mantua in West Philadelphia, is that generalizable or applicable to African Americans living in other neighborhoods in Philadelphia or in West Philadelphia, or where there are issues that were so specific to Mantua that that data isn't as generalizable to North Philadelphia or African Americans in other areas of the city. And then timeliness, as we mentioned. Sometimes the data you have access to is just the last time these data were collected, and you kind of have to use it. Maybe it was the last time a community health assessment was done in your neighborhood, in your city, or where you're doing your community health assessment. And hey, it was 10 years ago, and we know it's outdated, but guess what? This was what they said, and interesting, we found something similar 10 years later, right? So you would use those data in a different way. You're not using it to replace how people feel now, but it might be useful to you when you're working on your health assessment 10 years later in the current day. So there's more detail about this in the slides that I will send you, as I told you not today. Bless you.